The official story of the Panama Canal celebrates engineering triumph, political power, and global trade. What it rarely acknowledges is the human cost buried beneath the concrete and steel. Before ships ever crossed the isthmus, the land itself became a grave. In the late 19th century, the French attempt to build the canal collapsed not only from financial ruin, but from mass death. Tropical diseases tore through the workforce. Malaria and yellow fever spread unchecked. Medical science had not yet accepted mosquitoes as vectors. Workers fell ill within days of arrival. Many never recovered. Deaths were recorded inconsistently. Some were logged, others vanished entirely. When the United States took control of the project in 1904, it inherited not just an unfinished canal, but a population already shaped by loss. Tens of thousands of laborers were recruited, primarily from the Caribbean. Men from Barbados, Jamaica, Martinique, and Trinidad arrived believing they were joining steady employment. Few were told the truth. They were assigned to the most dangerous work zones: excavation, blasting, swamp drainage, and landslide-prone slopes. They lived in overcrowded camps, often segregated by race. White American workers received better housing, health care, and wages. Black Caribbean workers were paid less, fed worse, and exposed to greater risk. The canal zone became an industrial killing field. Landslides buried entire crews, explosions misfired, equipment failed, men were crushed by rock, drowned in sudden floods, or poisoned by disease. Bodies were removed quickly to keep work moving. Replacement labor arrived faster than graves could be dug. Official U.S. records acknowledge approximately 5,600 deaths during the American construction phase, but historians have long questioned that number. It excludes French-era deaths. It excludes unregistered workers. It excludes those who died after returning home from illness contracted on the job. The real number is unknown. Some estimates suggest more than 25,000 workers died across both construction periods. Others place the toll even higher. The absence of comprehensive records makes certainty impossible, and that absence was not accidental. Many deaths were classified vaguely: disease, accident, unknown. Names were misspelled or omitted. Nationalities were reduced to numbers. In some cases, deaths were never reported at all. The laborers who died were not memorialized. Their families were rarely notified. Compensation was minimal or non-existent. The canal advanced while their stories disappeared beneath administrative silence. Meanwhile, public narratives focused on progress. Photographs showed massive machines carving through mountains. Speeches praised American ingenuity. Newspapers celebrated the conquest of nature. The human cost was treated as collateral, unfortunate but necessary. Medical reforms eventually reduced disease, but danger never disappeared. Even as yellow fever was controlled, industrial hazards remained constant. Safety protocols were minimal. Workers were expendable. The canal was completed in 1914. Ships passed through. The world applauded. The dead were not counted again. Decades later, historians attempting to reconstruct the true cost encountered missing archives, destroyed logs, and incomplete payrolls. Caribbean nations preserved oral histories instead. Stories passed through families about fathers and brothers who never returned. The canal reshaped global commerce. It also erased thousands of lives from the historical record. And the erasure was as deliberate as the construction itself. The work did not pause for death, it absorbed it. Every morning, labor gangs were reassigned based on who was still alive. If a crew lost men the day before, replacements arrived without ceremony. There was no investigation, no moment of silence, no official acknowledgement beyond a mark on a ledger, if the death was recorded at all. The canal zone functioned as a machine, and workers were components designed to be consumed. Most Caribbean laborers existed under a dual-wage system. Officially, it was described as administrative convenience. In reality, it enforced racial hierarchy. American white workers were paid in gold-backed currency, lived in screened housing, received ice, refrigeration, and access to modern hospitals. Black and non-white workers were paid in silver, housed in barracks near swamps and excavation sites, and treated in overcrowded medical wards, if they were treated at all. Disease remained constant even as public health campaigns expanded. Mosquito control reduced yellow fever dramatically, but malaria persisted. Workers weakened by heat, exhaustion, and malnutrition were more vulnerable. A single infection could end a career or a life within weeks. Medical records were selective. Hospitals recorded admissions, not outcomes. Many laborers died in camps, not clinics. Others were sent home sick, only to die months later in their countries of origin. These deaths never entered canal statistics. The excavation zones were among the most lethal industrial environments of the early 20th century. Dynamite blasts were routine. Miscalculations were common. Warning systems were primitive. A single delayed signal could kill dozens. When explosions went wrong, bodies were recovered quickly if they could be recovered at all. Landslides were worse. Culebra Cut, the most infamous section of the canal, was unstable by nature. Entire hillsides shifted without warning. Trains were swallowed. Equipment disappeared. Workers were buried under thousands of tons of earth. In some cases, recovery was impossible. The ground was leveled and work resumed directly over mass graves. These incidents were not hidden from supervisors. They were documented internally as inevitable losses. The language mattered. Loss implied material, not human consequence. The vocabulary of construction stripped death of identity. Men became obstacles removed, delays resolved, costs absorbed. Official correspondence focused on timelines and budgets, not bodies. Families back home waited for letters that never arrived. Many Caribbean workers were recruited through labor agents who promised wages but offered no guarantees. Contracts were vague. Accountability was diffuse. When workers died, responsibility dissolved into bureaucracy. Widows received nothing. Parents received nothing. In many cases, families never learned what happened at all. Their sons simply vanished. The Canal Administration did not actively notify next of kin for most non-American workers. It was considered impractical. Distance, language barriers, and cost were cited as reasons. The effect was erasure. The American public rarely saw these realities. Newspapers emphasized success stories and medical breakthroughs. When deaths were mentioned, they were framed as unavoidable challenges of tropical engineering. Individual names were never printed. This selective visibility shaped memory. Even among surviving workers, silence was enforced by necessity. Complaints could lead to dismissal or blacklisting. Strikes were suppressed. Racial segregation prevented unified resistance. The workforce was intentionally fragmented. Fear replaced solidarity. By the time the canal neared completion, the death toll had already faded into abstraction. Numbers were debated, revised, minimized. French-era fatalities were dismissed as the failures of another nation. American-era deaths were framed as tragic but controlled. No comprehensive memorial was built. When the canal opened, global attention shifted instantly. Trade routes changed. Naval power expanded. The canal became a symbol of modernity. The men who died building it became footnotes, if mentioned at all. Their graves were unmarked. Some were buried in makeshift cemeteries later destroyed by development. Others were interred in mass plots without identifiers. Many were never buried formally. The climate ensured decomposition was rapid. Memory faded faster. Years later, when historians attempted to reconstruct payrolls and death registers, entire segments were missing. Records had been lost, damaged, or deliberately discarded. The Canal Authority maintained no obligation to preserve labor histories. What survived were fragments, a name scratched into a diary, a shipping manifest with crossed-out entries, oral histories carried by descendants who remembered only absence. Entire communities in the Caribbean had demographic gaps, missing men of working age who never returned. These gaps were not accidental. The canal required sacrifice, and the system ensured that sacrifice remained invisible. Those with power were preserved in history. Those without were erased. The narrative of triumph depended on forgetting the cost. Today, ships pass through the canal in hours. Tourists photograph locks and machinery. Few are told that beneath the waterline lie uncounted dead. Fewer still learn that the official death toll represents only what was convenient to record. The canal did not simply reshape geography. It rewrote history by omission. And the workers who died building one of the world's greatest engineering feats remain largely unnamed, unacknowledged, and unreconciled, absorbed into progress, and then forgotten. The erasure did not end when construction stopped. It continued quietly, systematically, long after the canal opened and the world moved on. Once the Panama Canal was operational, the workforce that built it was no longer useful. Many surviving laborers were dismissed with little notice. Some returned home with chronic illnesses. Others stayed in Panama, aging in poverty near the very structure that had consumed their youth. The administration focused on efficiency and maintenance, not reckoning. No formal accounting of worker deaths was ever completed. The absence was institutional. There was no legal requirement to reconcile incomplete records, no political incentive to revisit uncomfortable truths. The canal was a geopolitical success, and successes are rarely audited for moral cost. As decades passed, archives deteriorated. Paper records stored in tropical conditions rotted. Floods damaged storage rooms. Files were reorganized, culled, or destroyed during administrative transitions. Each loss reduced the possibility of clarity. Each missing ledger narrowed the space for accountability. In official histories commissioned by the United States government, worker deaths were reduced to aggregate figures. Even those figures varied wildly depending on the source. Some reports cited fewer than 6,000 deaths during the American phase. Others acknowledged that the number excluded contract laborers, unregistered workers, and those who died outside canal hospitals. No effort was made to reconcile the discrepancy. The French records were worse. Financial collapse had scattered documents across continents. Some were lost in bankruptcy proceedings. Others were deliberately suppressed to avoid scandal. The French canal effort had already been framed as a national embarrassment. Counting the dead only deepened that failure. As a result, the dead fell into a statistical void between empires. Caribbean governments began raising questions in the mid-20th century. Officials from Barbados, Jamaica, and other islands requested information about workers who never returned. Most inquiries were met with silence or vague responses. The Canal Administration claimed records no longer existed. Responsibility was deflected. The implication was clear. If the documents were gone, so was the obligation. Families carried the consequences instead. In many Caribbean communities, the canal left a visible demographic scar. Entire generations of men disappeared. Children grew up without fathers. Women survived on remittances that abruptly stopped. Some communities developed oral traditions centered on absence, stories of men who went to Panama and were never seen again. These stories were not treated as historical evidence. They were dismissed as anecdotal. Yet when historians later compared oral histories across islands, patterns emerged. Similar timelines, similar descriptions of illness, accidents, and sudden silence, similar lack of official notification. The consistency suggested systemic failure, not isolated tragedy. Still, no comprehensive investigation followed. The canal's symbolic power shielded it. It was presented as a marvel of human achievement, proof of progress through engineering. Questioning its cost was framed as ungrateful or revisionist. The dead remained politically inconvenient. Even commemorations reflected this imbalance. Statues honored engineers, administrators, and political leaders. Plaques listed dates, dimensions, and tonnage. Rarely did they mention labor. When they did, it was in abstract terms: the workers, the workforce, never individuals. Names were absent. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, scholars attempted to reconstruct the death toll using indirect methods. Census data from Caribbean islands showed population declines inconsistent with migration alone. Shipping logs indicated labor movements that did not match return records. Hospital admission books showed mortality rates far exceeding official totals. These studies suggested that the true death toll could be several times higher than acknowledged. But without primary documentation, estimates remained contested. Governments could continue to deny responsibility by pointing to uncertainty. Ambiguity became a defense. The canal zone itself offered little help. Cemeteries associated with construction had been relocated, neglected, or built over. Some burial sites were never formally recorded. Environmental conditions erased markers quickly. Time finished what bureaucracy began. What survived most clearly was inequality. American workers were more likely to have names recorded, deaths documented, families notified. Their graves were maintained. Their stories entered national memory. Caribbean workers, who made up the majority of the labor force, were treated as interchangeable units of labor. Their deaths were administrative inconveniences, not historical events. This disparity was not accidental. It reflected the racial and colonial hierarchies of the era. The canal did not create those hierarchies, it exploited them. The silence around worker deaths became part of a broader pattern in global infrastructure projects. Massive undertakings celebrated outcomes while minimizing human cost. The canal became an early template for how labor exploitation could be normalized, documented selectively, and then forgotten. In recent years, calls for recognition have resurfaced. Descendants of canal workers have demanded memorials, compensation, and acknowledgement. Some Caribbean governments have supported these efforts. Academic conferences have revisited the issue. Museums have begun including labor narratives. But official reconciliation remains limited. There is still no complete list of the dead, no official apology, no unified memorial naming those who were lost. The canal's success continues to overshadow its human toll. The workers did not vanish by accident. Their history was erased through neglect, bureaucracy, and deliberate omission. Progress required forgetting, and forgetting was enforced by power. The Panama Canal stands today as both an engineering triumph and a monument to uncounted sacrifice. Beneath its waters and along its banks lies a history fragmented beyond repair, not because it could not be preserved, but because preserving it was never prioritized. The canal reshaped global trade. It also demonstrated how easily human lives could be absorbed into achievement and then written out of memory. What remains is absence. And absence, when repeated often enough, becomes policy.